Hey there. Thanks for joining me out here again for yet another night of stargazing. I figure tonight we'll just keep going down the zodiac. Yep, you know the drill. Just give me your hand and right up there. That you're looking at now is Aquarius. And I had to think really hard about how to pronounce that because I swear Invincible makes me want to call it Aquarius every time. Anyway, as you can probably tell, Aquarius is one of the bigger constellations. I think it might be 10th largest, if I recall correctly. Don't quote me on that. Either way, I'm sure you've seen the depictions before. You know that Aquarius is a handsome young man pouring water out of his urn. But if I have taught you anything about the ancient Greeks so far, it should be that nothing is ever just anything. There always has to be some sort of a story. And Aquarius, of course, is no exception. That beautiful young man pouring water from an urn is none other than Ganymede. And actually, it's not water he's pouring out at all, it's nectar. You know, like nectar of the gods. Well, the story goes that Ganymede was the son of King Tros, who, incidentally, I'm sure you've heard of Troy. King Tros is who gave Troy its name. One day it so happened that Ganymede was watching over his father's sheep whenever, as he tends to love to do in these stories, Zeus was looking down upon mortal affairs and saw Ganymede, and in this instance he, immediately fell in love with the guy. He was the most beautiful thing Zeus had ever seen. Sorry to Hera, his wife, who he's supposed to love, but anyway. This mortal boy was the prettiest thing ever, and Zeus had to have him. So, naturally, as one does, Zeus turned himself into an eagle and swooped down to grab Ganymede and take him back up to Olympus with him. Something that I think is pretty neat, actually, is that the eagle that Zeus turned into, or sent down to grab him, one or the other, is commemorated in that constellation right next to Aquarius. That's called Aquila, the eagle. And they're related, so naturally they're right next to each other, and has nothing to do with storytellers just making things fit. Nope, they were always related. That's why they're so close together. Anyway, that's how it goes. Ganymede was taken up to Olympus, and his father was presented with some nice horses as compensation for losing his only son. You know, Zeus always making sure that he gives the mortals a fair bargain. I know this is your progeny and your heir, but here, have some ponies. You'll feel better. There's another version of the myth, actually, that says that Ganymede was fought over by not just Zeus, but also Eos, goddess of the dawn. And the two were both really in love with Ganymede. And, well, unfortunately for Eos, Zeus is omnipotent, and you can't hide anything from him, and so he stole the little guy anyway. Well, no matter how Ganymede came to be in Zeus's possession, I guess, at the end of the day, he became the, servant boy for the gods of Olympus. He would be the waiter, almost, for the gods of Olympus. He would carry his urn full of nectar and dispense it at their leisure. And, as you can imagine, much to the annoyance of Hera. Big shocker. The whole myth, though, interestingly enough, both interpretations, being that Zeus just took him or that he fought over him with Eos, were extremely popular myths in both Greece and Rome. And the reason for that is actually because the myth was regarded as the divine approval of homosexuality, which, personally, I think is kinda cool, even if it involves Zeus, who is kind of a loser, and a young man who probably didn't want to go with Zeus, but he gave his dad ponies, so everything's fine. But this was actually the myth that kind of, it didn't start the wave of gay acceptance in Greece and Rome, but it was like heavily valued for that, divine encouragement. And, well, in that way, Aquarius is kind of like the unofficial pride constellation, I guess. If you're okay with having it be associated with, uh, stealing a guy just out of the air, flying in as an eagle, taking him away. I mean, I'm sure he lived a happy life up on Olympus. I mean, he seemingly served of his own accord. And, he got to hang out with a bunch of, like, really hot gods and goddesses, so it can't be that bad. I have mixed feelings on the association, but I do have positive feelings on the fact that it was the myth that was partially responsible for the widespread gay diaspora in the ancient Greek and Roman times. You might find yourself thinking that this myth is kind of short and a little insubstantial compared to some of the other ones we've talked about. And that could just be that it was a nice and easy story to fit into the constellation, or it could have something to do with the fact that the Greeks kind of stole this constellation. They took the constellation that the ancient Egyptians noted as being representative of the god of the Nile, and they made it into Ganymede and his urn. So in that way, it was much more trying to find a story that made sense to put there, and much less the usual way where they had a story and were trying to find something that vaguely resembled it in the sky. This one they just kind of looked at and they thought, that's a nice constellation that somebody else has a name and a story for, but we like this story better. As the ancient Greek philosophers and storytellers were wont to do, everything had to mean something to them, and it couldn't mean something to somebody else. No, it has to mean something specific about our stories and our myths. So that is the reason we know Aquarius as it is today, instead of seeing it as the god of the Nile like the Egyptians did. There are actually two other stories that some writers tried to pin on Aquarius. One writer suggested that it was actually Deucalion, who was the son of the famous Prometheus. Deucalion was one of the very few to have supposedly escaped this great flood from Greek mythology. And it was said then that he now is in the stars and pouring forth water, the same water, in fact, that he had had to outrun in his life. Yet another interpretation would be that the constellation is actually Cecrops, who was an old king of Athens. He was pouring the water to make a sacrifice to the gods because, in his time, wine hadn't been invented yet, so water was just what you drank, and he was sacrificing that instead of the traditional, wine and food sacrifices. One last thing to talk about, because you should know me by this point, and therefore know that I will basically always find something else to talk about if you give me the time, is that Aquarius is actually considered a very lucky constellation. A good many of the stars in Aquarius have names that begin with SAD, and this is actually not a coincidence. It is derived from the Arabic word Saad, and that is a word that translates to lucky or fortunate or blessed. So, as a result of that, if you buy into the whole astrology thing, people born under Aquarius tend to be a little bit more lucky than some others. Anyway, that's about all I got for tonight. We can head back on inside now, but before we do, thanks for joining me for these. They've quickly become some of my favorite nights that we spend together. I appreciate you listening to my stories and just taking a little time to wonder with me.